Hello all of you beautiful people, Jules here for Whatculture.com, and I have a very special list for you today because when you think about making a movie, there are countless reels upon reels of footage that people create in order to stitch all together into the final product, because even still, when you've got this amount of footage, there are some times where you just go, yeah, we didn't foresee that we'd need this footage, or this doesn't work here, so we're going to need to borrow from somebody else. So my boss approached me this morning and said, Jules, you absolute thief of hearts, why don't you host this list? And I said, well, I'm contractually obliged to do so. So with this in mind, I'm Jules, this is Whatculture.com, and these are 10 movies that you didn't realise stole their footage from other films. Number 10, Stigmata used subway footage from Money Train. So, when Rupert Wainwright was putting together his cult classic horror film, there came the need for him to use some subway footage, but there was just one problem. He was absolutely broke at the time and had no room in the budget to actually afford to shoot it there. So what did he do? He got to thieving. The shot that Wainwright and his creative team ended up using came from the 1995 action film Money Train, which had plenty of scenes featuring speeding subway cars for obvious reasons, and it also featured in Stigmata for just a mere few seconds. During the scene where Frankie is being lashed by invisible whips, the camera briefly cuts to an exterior shot of the train travelling at high speed, and that was footage that was recycled from the Wesley Snipes-fronted movie. And even though that most viewers wouldn't even notice because the footage is so fleeting, if you look closely you can actually see that there's some damage done to the front of the train with like a metal pole sticking out of it thanks to one of Money Train's action sequences. Number 10. Transformers Dark of the Moon's highway chase was taken from the island. Now this is a strange one because Michael Bay movies, they make absolute bank, even though sometimes they definitely shouldn't. But apparently even he likes to cheap out from time to time because some of the action chase sequences that were used in Dark of the Moon were actually lifted from the island. Bay and his creative team simply superimposed a massive robot onto the existing footage and just hoped that nobody would notice. Well, you know what? Somebody did. And once the scenes were placed side by side, there's no denying that this is a recycled shot. Now, when you think about these two films side by side, you've got one which is about giant robotic monstrosities clanking each other in the swinging wrecking balls, and the other which is about a kind of super government conspiracy theory. Yet for some reason, they will share this DNA forever. You're welcome. Number 8. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure borrowed a battle scene from War and Peace. So remember that rather famous scene in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure where the pair arrive out and go, "Whoa dude, we're like in a battle or something." Well, it turns out that battle or something was taken from the film War and Peace. So the director had to try and improvise. It's obvious that the scene was taken from elsewhere, given that the two films clearly have very different production values, and the fact that a goofball time-hopping comedy had the audacity to poach footage from a highbrow literary adaptation is rather hilarious. Now, stealing scenes from elsewhere is usually something that is quite frowned upon, but here, well, it's a totally excellent joke, my dudes. Number 7. Star Trek Generations reused exploding Klingon footage. Now this is the thing, when you think about the old Star Trek films, there's one thing that all of them had in common, and that was blowing up tiny little miniatures, making them into grand cinematic spectacles for the silver screen. But the question is, if you've already done that a few times, why bother going through the rigmarole of trying to make a new model just to blow it up? Just use some old footage. So that's exactly what the Star Trek Generations creative team did when they were putting together the space battle between the United Federations of Planets and the Klingon Empire. A Klingon bird of prey was scripted to explode, but was it worth constructing one for the sake of this tiny action shot? Well, the answer they arrived at was no. So they took the decision to cut and paste footage of an exploding bird of prey from the previous Star Trek film, Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. Now, usually they try and modify the footage, but here it was just straight unedited footage. They were just like, you know what, just no one's going to notice. But we did, because Star Trek fans, they are relentless. Number 6. Transformers lifted an aircraft carrier from Pearl Harbor. Now here's another example of Michael Bay lifting footage from a film, but I guess we'll give him a bit of a break on this one because he's actually lifting from his own film. Can you steal from yourself? Yes, by the way, I do know the answers to that one. Yes, you can steal from yourself if you get blind drunk and do random eBay and Amazon ordering. Thanks, Past Jules. Brilliant. Good one. Yeah, nice. Asshole. In the original Transformers, there's a brief establishing shot depicting a massive battleship ahead of the movie's naval scene. And said shot was lifted directly from Bay's war movie Pearl Harbor with a number of modifications. Lining the two shots up side by side is like a game of movie-themed Spot the Difference. There are modern fighter jets and more elaborate equipment on board the battleship to reflect the Transformers' present-day setting, and that's just for starters. But it turns out that what Michael Bay's creative team did was actually take a modern aircraft carrier and digitally downgraded it to use in Pearl Harbor. So they actually undid the work they did to put it back in the Transformers film. Weird. Number 5. Rogue One recycled old Star Wars archive footage. So it seems to be that around the time of The Force Awakens and indeed Rogue One that the Star Wars franchise was finally being resurrected. It was coming back to life. But it turns out that it wasn't just the film franchise itself that was having a second win, because it turns out the footage used in the original films made a second go-around. Nice. The prequel incorporated unused footage of some pilots into its final battle sequence at the Shield Gate around Scarif. Rather than recast or indeed recreate actors, Gareth Edwards inserted archived shots of them into the final cut and reworked his script to tie in with their dialogue. Edwards discovered the footage, which was originally filmed for A New Hope's Battle of Yavin, while touring the Skywalker Ranch, and his special effects team were able to seamlessly integrate it into Rogue One's final act, clearly using the Force, and probably a lot of technical know-how. Still, it looked great. Number 4. Attack of the Clones borrowed Jedi Temple footage from The Phantom Menace. So when the team were making Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, they came across a rather unusual problem, and it wasn't to do with any of the sets or props that they'd made or the CGI wizardry that they used to create such amazing images. In fact, it was just because of a change in locale. They moved shooting from England over to Australia, and therefore some of the actors that they needed for certain shots just weren't available anymore. Rather than recasting a bunch of aliens and having the special effects team provide additional CGI, director George Lucas lifted shots of the Council from the previous movie, The Phantom Menace, and then carried them over into the sequel. For eagle-eyed fans, the recycling was pretty easy to spot. During the scene where Anakin and Obi-Wan address the Council, the backdrops are identical to a sequence in the previous movie where Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn attend the temple. And yeah, it's got to definitely be the last resort possible if you're going to try and borrow anything from The Phantom Menace. Oof. Number 3. Hitman's entire opening credits are from Dark Angel. This one is so cheeky, it beggars belief here. Now, usually when you're going to try and use other footage from other films, you're just going to use a shot or two, just a fleeting image, just to tie things together. But here, in the Hitman film, they borrowed so much that it was just unashamed stealing. Fox was clearly in a hurry to kick this movie out of the gate, so they gave the director permission to copy and paste footage from its hit TV show Dark Angel, though the end results were more subtle than they actually might sound. As Dark Angel is similarly themed to Hitman, footage of its generically enhanced children training up as assassins and super soldiers deputized for Agent 47's origin story pretty fine, with some editing here or there. And they were actually quite clever about it as well, because they used footage from the TV show's pilot, so again, not many people would have actually seen it, and the end result was actually pretty decent. If the overall film could only have lived up to that expectation, eh? What a stinker. Number 2. Blade Runner recycled weather footage from The Shining. So, the original ending to Blade Runner was a bit of a downer. That is an understatement. And when it was received pretty poorly with test audiences, director Ridley Scott went back to the drawing board and said, okay, we'll give them a more upbeat ending. But unfortunately, he didn't actually have many shots to make that with, so he had to get thieving. Because even though he wanted to have the ending now show Deckard and his lover leaving the dystopian cityscapes behind for a new life in the sprawling countryside, there was just one teeny tiny problem. Miserable weather during a location shoot didn't fit with the tone of his upbeat ending. So Scott's solution was to call up fellow filmmaker Stanley Kubrick and request B-roll footage from The Shining. When adapting the Stephen King novel, Kubrick shot around 17 hours of helicopter footage of the Montana mountains, most of which never obviously appeared in the film. But some of it did, however, appear in the theatrical cut of Blade Runner. And now when you see those brilliant blue skies at the end of Blade Runner, you're going to always now remember them as being tinged with a bit of ethereal madness, because yes, they are indeed from The Shining, and that makes the whole ending a lot more creepy. And number 1, Raiders of the Lost Ark use stock footage from Lost Horizon. Now, the concept of an Indiana Jones film not having enough money to shoot a certain scene is like a laughable premise today, but yes, that was indeed the case back when Steven Spielberg suddenly was like, I've run out of money, pals! I got none left! Can somebody help a fella out? That's not what he sounds like. Spielberg was able to save $1 here and there by renting stock footage to serve as Raiders of the Lost Ark's iconic map transitions. The imagery of a DC-3 flying over the Himalayas was originally created for the 1973 film Lost Horizon. And this wasn't the only time the movie's creative team was forced to make do with stock footage. Shots from 1975's The Hindenburg were used to double as a 1930 street. Well, to be honest, it's much cheaper than building one, right? Due to the success of Raiders, the next film in the series, The Temple of Doom, enjoyed a budget of $10 million more than its predecessor, and that rose with every installment since.